Imagine a world where power was a deadly gamble, and ruling as a queen meant walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. In the ancient world, Rome ruled with unmatched strength, but it was also a realm where fear, betrayal and political cruelty were constant companions. For the women who dared wear crowns, the stakes were unimaginably high. They weren't just facing assassination, they were subjected to punishment so brutal, so calculated, that death sometimes would have been the mercy. Picture a queen flogged in public, her daughters violated and humiliated, while her lands were burned to ashes. Another is captured and paraded in chains before thousands, stripped of every ounce of dignity, her power erased not with a sword, but through relentless psychological torment. Somewhere else, a young princess sits in exile in a sacred temple, alive but powerless, knowing her fate could be sealed at any moment by political rivals. And then there's the queen who chooses her own death. Not to escape Rome, but to reclaim the one thing Rome cannot take, her dignity. These are not myths. These are the true stories of queens who defied Rome. Women like Boudica, Cleopatra, Zenobia, Agrippina, Theodora and Arsinoe, names that echo across centuries, not because they were flawless rulers, but because they faced cruelty and punishment unlike anything history had ever seen. They weren't just killed, they were humiliated, psychologically tortured, stripped of agency, watched as their families were destroyed, and sometimes forced to witness the collapse of everything they had fought for. Their lives were a series of battles, not only on the battlefield, but against fear, betrayal, and the relentless machinery of Roman vengeance. Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe in ancient Britain, stands as a symbol of resistance against Rome's imperial domination. Unlike the Roman women whose fates were sealed behind palace walls, Boudica faced the might of Rome not as part of the empire, but as a sovereign threatened by conquest. Her story highlights that punishment worse than death could be inflicted not only through execution or exile, but through systemic humiliation, destruction of family, and annihilation of entire communities. Boudica was born into the Iceni aristocracy, a tribe in what is now eastern England. She married King Prasutagus, who sought to protect his people and family from Roman encroachment. In his will, Prasutagus attempted to secure both the autonomy of the Iceni, and the protection of his wife and daughters, by leaving half his kingdom to Rome and half to Boudica and their children. Rome, however, ignored this arrangement, revealing the empire's willingness to punish women and femmes who challenged its authority, regardless of prior agreements. After Prasutagus' death, the Roman response was brutal. Boudica and her daughters were publicly flogged, humiliated, and stripped of property. This act was not merely physical punishment, it was deeply psychological and symbolic, intended to degrade and demonstrate Rome's absolute power. For Boudica, the punishment was compounded by the destruction of family dignity. Her children's security and her personal autonomy were violated in the most public and humiliating way. This form of torment exemplifies the Roman understanding that the annihilation of social and familial structures could serve as a punishment far more devastating than death itself. The humiliation and violence inflicted upon Boudica ignited a rebellion. In 6061 CE she led the Iceni and allied tribes in a revolt against Roman forces. Her leadership illustrates the unique power of queens in mobilizing resistance, even under extreme oppression. However, her campaign also exposed her to extraordinary danger, as Rome's retaliation was swift, overwhelming, and indiscriminate. The empire's response to Boudica's revolt demonstrates how Rome combined physical punishment with societal terror, aiming not only to defeat but to obliterate those who dared resist. During the uprising, Boudica's forces destroyed several Roman settlements, including Camulodunum, Londinium and Verulamium. These attacks were not only military but also psychological. They asserted dominance, avenged humiliation, and sent a message to other tribes that defiance carried catastrophic consequences. The rebellion illustrates that punishment worse than death, was not always administered by Rome alone. Queens like Boudica could experience it through the annihilation of their communities and the collapse of the structures that sustained them. Ultimately, Boudica's rebellion was crushed by the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus. Ancient sources suggest she either died by poison or in battle, her final fate shrouded in uncertainty. Yet even in death, the punishment endured. Her kingdom was devastated, her people subjugated, and her daughter's future determined by Roman authority. Boudica's struggle exemplifies the comprehensive nature of Roman punishment for queens who defied the empire. It extended to family, territory, social identity, and legacy, leaving survivors to bear the consequences of resistance for generations. Cleopatra Z, the legendary last pharaoh of Egypt, embodies another dimension of Rome's punitive capabilities. Her punishment was both political and psychological, culminating in a forced end that combined humiliation, loss of autonomy, and eventual death. Cleopatra's life demonstrates that for a queen who challenged Rome's supremacy, punishment could be prolonged, manipulative, and designed to destroy not only power but legacy, influence, and dignity. These are not myths. These are the true stories of queens who defied Rome. Women like Boudica, Cleopatra, Zenobia, Agrippina, Theodora, and Arsinoe, names that echo across centuries. Not because they were flawless rulers, but because they faced cruelty and punishment, unlike anything history had ever seen. They weren't just killed, they were humiliated, psychologically tortured, stripped of agency, watched as their families were destroyed, and sometimes forced to witness collapse of everything they had fought for. Their lives were a series of battles, not only on the battlefield, but against fear, betrayal, and the relentless machinery of Roman vengeance. Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe in ancient Britain, stands as a symbol of resistance against Rome's imperial domination. Unlike the Roman women whose fates were sealed behind palace walls, Boudica faced the might of Rome, not as part of the empire, but as a sovereign threatened by conquest. Her story highlights that punishment worse than death could be inflicted not only through execution or exile, but through systemic humiliation, destruction of family, and annihilation of entire communities. Boudica was born into the Iceni aristocracy, a tribe in what is now eastern England. She married King Prasutagus, who sought to protect his people and family from Roman encroachment. In his will, Prasutagus attempted to secure both the autonomy of the Iceni and the protection of his wife and daughters, by leaving half his kingdom to Rome and half to Boudica and their children. Rome, however, ignored this arrangement, revealing the empire's willingness to punish women and families who challenge its authority, regardless of prior agreements. After Prasutagus' death, the Roman response was brutal. Boudica and her daughters were publicly flogged, humiliated, and stripped of property. This act was not merely physical punishment, it was deeply psychological and symbolic, intended to degrade and demonstrate Rome's absolute power. For Boudica, the punishment was compounded by the destruction of family dignity. Her children's security and her personal autonomy were violated in the most public and humiliating way. This form of torment exemplifies the Roman understanding that the annihilation of social and familial structures could serve as a punishment far more devastating than death itself. The humiliation and violence inflicted upon Boudica ignited a rebellion. In 60-61 C, she led the Iceni allied tribes in a revolt against Roman forces. Her leadership illustrates the unique power of queens in mobilizing resistance, even under extreme oppression. However, her campaign also exposed her to extraordinary danger, as Rome's retaliation was swift, overwhelming, and indiscriminate. The empire's response to Boudica's revolt demonstrates how Rome combined physical punishment with societal terror, aiming not only to defeat, but to obliterate those who dared resist. During the uprising, Boudica's forces destroyed several Roman settlements, including Camuladunum, Londinium, and Verulamium. These attacks were not only military but also psychological. They asserted dominance, avenged humiliation, and sent a message to other tribes that defiance carried catastrophic consequences. The rebellion illustrates that punishment worse than death was not always administered by Rome alone. Queens like Boudica could experience it through the annihilation of their communities, and the collapse of the structures that sustained them. Ultimately, Boudica's rebellion was crushed by the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus. Ancient sources suggest she either died by poison or in battle. Her final fate shrouded in uncertainty. Yet even in death, the punishment endured. Her kingdom was devastated, her people subjugated, and her daughter's future determined by Roman authority. Boudica's struggle exemplifies the comprehensive nature of Roman punishment for queens who defied the empire. It extended to family, territory, social identity, and legacy, leaving survivors to bear the consequences of resistance for generations. Cleopatra II, the legendary last pharaoh of Egypt, embodies another dimension of Rome's punitive capabilities. Her punishment was both political and psychological, culminating in a forced end that combined humiliation, loss of autonomy, and eventual death. Cleopatra's life demonstrates that for a queen who challenged Rome's supremacy, punishment could be prolonged, manipulative, and designed to destroy not only power but legacy, influence, and dignity. Born in 69 BC into the Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra ascended the throne of Egypt in 51 BCE, co-ruling initially with her younger brother Ptolemy EC. From the beginning, her reign was marked by internal conflict, political intrigue, and threats to her authority. As a female monarch in a male-dominated world, she faced skepticism from domestic factions, foreign powers, and later, the Roman Empire itself. Rome's punitive system was uniquely capable of targeting queens. It could simultaneously threaten personal safety, political influence, and familial legacy, creating a multifaceted and enduring form of suffering. Cleopatra's first encounters with Rome's power came through her relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. These alliances were strategic, designed to preserve Egypt's sovereignty and strengthen her political position. However, they also placed her in a dangerous position, tying her fate to the ambitions and conflicts of Rome's most powerful men. When Caesar was assassinated, Cleopatra's political vulnerability intensified. Her subsequent alliance with Mark Antony exposed her to not only the enmity of Octavian, but also the complex dynamics of Roman propaganda, where female leaders were often vilified as manipulative, seductive, and morally corrupt. This vilification was a form of psychological punishment, shaping public perception and undermining authority, even before physical confrontation. Cleopatra's greatest challenge came with the rise of Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. The tension between Rome and Egypt reached its climax during the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Cleopatra and Mark Antony faced the full weight of Roman military power, and their defeat was as much psychological as it was physical. Cleopatra, like many queens before her, experienced punishment worse than death, not through immediate execution, but through humiliation, loss of autonomy, and the annihilation of political and familial influence. Following the defeat, Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, acutely aware that Octavian would seek to assert control over Egypt and punish her for defying Rome. The city's walls could not protect her from the calculated strategies of Roman conquest. Cleopatra's choices during these final moments illustrate the extraordinary pressures faced by queens. She had to weigh personal survival against the preservation of dignity and the future of her children. Her eventual decision to commit suicide, famously by the bite of an asp, was not merely an act of desperation. It was a deliberate reclamation of agency in a situation engineered to strip her of all power. In choosing the manner and timing of her death, Cleopatra circumvented the humiliation and public spectacle that Rome intended, transforming the ultimate punishment into a final act of sovereignty. Cleopatra's story reveals that punishment worse than death could involve more than physical pain. It could be the gradual dismantling of influence, the manipulation of legacy, and the exposure to psychological torment that extended suffering over time. By taking her own life, Cleopatra evaded public humiliation, yet her legacy remained intricate to the consequences of her defiance. Her children, her dynasty, and her lands were all subject to Rome's calculated control, demonstrating that a queen's power could be undermined without immediate violence. Not long after Cleopatra, another queen rose in defiance of Roman authority in the east, Zenobia of Palmyra. Zenobia's story parallels Cleopatra's in ambition, but differs in her method of challenge. Born in 240 CE in the desert city of Palmyra, she was intelligent, politically savvy, and fiercely ambitious. When her husband Odenathus, ruler of Palmyra, was assassinated, Zenobia assumed regency over her young son Vabalathus and effectively controlled the empire. Unlike Cleopatra, she openly expanded her territories, conquering Egypt and parts of Anatolia, directly challenging Roman authority. Zenobia's rise illustrates the danger of female sovereignty to Rome. While male rulers could be subdued or co-opted, a woman commanding armies and negotiating treaties represented a direct affront to the patriarchal and imperial norms of the time. Her capture by Emperor Aurelian in 272 CE exemplifies Rome's sophisticated approach to punishment worse than death rather than executing her immediately. Aurelian subjected Zenobia to prolonged humiliation, transforming her from a sovereign into a public spectacle of submission. Historical accounts describe Zenobia's triumph in Rome. She was paraded in chains through the streets, adorned in golden garments that symbolized both her royal stature and her subjugation. Every step of the procedure was intended to strip her of dignity, reinforce Rome's dominance, and send a clear warning to other potential challengers. Zenobia, who had commanded armies and governed vast territories, was reduced to an object of public ridicule, her power neutralized in the most visible and psychological way imaginable. Zenobia's captivity highlights a key aspect of punishment worse than death: the erosion of autonomy. Unlike immediate execution, which ends suffering swiftly, Zenobia endured the knowledge that every aspect of her life was now under Roman control. Her identity as a queen, military strategist, and political authority was systematically dismantled. This form of torment was both psychological and symbolic, designed to maintain Roman supremacy, while extending personal suffering over time. Even in captivity, Zenobia's influence could not be fully erased. Accounts suggest that she was treated with a degree of respect by Aurelian, possibly married to a Roman noble, or allowed to live comfortably under supervision. Yet, despite any comforts, her life remained a shadow of its former glory. She had lost her empire, her sovereignty, and her ability to shape history. The psychological weight of this transformation, from commanding ruler to powerless captive, illustrates that the most devastating punishments were those that targeted the mind, identity, and legacy rather than merely the body. Zenobia's story also underscores the gendered strategies of Roman punishment. Male leaders defeated in battle might be executed or exiled swiftly, but female rulers were often subjected to humiliation, symbolic degradation, and public spectacle. Parading Zenobia in chains was not only a political statement but a cultural one. It demonstrated that women who wielded power independently could be neutralized through prolonged, psychological, and social torment. Rome's approach combined political pragmatism with calculated cruelty, ensuring that the succoring queen served both as punishment and as a warning to others. The broader social implications of Zenobia's subjugation were profound. Her capture and humiliation reinforced Rome's patriarchal and imperial hierarchies, showing that defiance by women in positions of authority would be met with both public spectacle and systemic dismantling. Her legacy, although partially preserved through accounts of her intelligence and ambition, was forever marked by her defeat. The punishment inflicted upon her extended beyond the individual to serve as a cautionary tale for other rulers, particularly women, highlighting the complex calculated cruelty of imperial governance. Zenobia's resilience during these trials remains remarkable. She maintained composure, dignity and a sense of self-worth, even as her empire was dismantled and her identity, as a sovereign, was systematically eroded. Her story illustrates the extraordinary fortitude required of queens navigating male-dominated societies, where defiance could provoke sophisticated forms of punishment that targeted not only life but legacy, agency, and social standing. As we move forward in history, the patterns established with queens like Cleopatra and Zenobia repeat with chilling consistency. Agrippina the Younger, Theodora, and Arsinoe IV all faced punishments that combined physical threat, psychological torment, and social humiliation. Each queen's story demonstrates that in the eyes of Rome, and its imperial successors, female authority was simultaneously high-evil, dangerous, and highly regulated, with punishment designed to neutralize influence without necessarily resorting to immediate execution. Following Zenobia, the Roman Empire's history offers no shortage of queens whose lives illustrate punishment worse than death. Agrippina the Younger, mother of Emperor Nero, embodies the lethal combination of ambition, influence and political intrigue. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty in 15 CE, Agrippina grew up in the shadow of powerful men, her every move scrutinized and politicized. Yet she was ambitious and unyielding, determined to secure power for herself and her son. Her position in the imperial family afforded her influence, but it also placed her squarely in the crosshairs of a system designed to punish women who dared wield authority. Agrippina's early life was marked by exile, political maneuvering, and forced marriages orchestrated to consolidate power and neutralize threats. The young princess witnessed firsthand the deadly consequences of familial rivalry. Her father, Germanicus, had been a popular general whose sudden death fueled rumors of poisoning, likely orchestrated by rivals in the court. Agrippina internalized these lessons. Power came at a cost, and women in her position faced relentless threats, not only from enemies outside the family but from within it. When her husband, Emperor Claudius, ascended to the throne, Agrippina skillfully maneuvered to place her son Nero as heir, sidelining other potential successors. She exercised authority, influence, and intelligence, but each step forward increased her vulnerability. Roman politics was a treacherous arena, and every act of ambition invited retaliation. Her persistent engagement in court intrigues made her a target of suspicion and fear, ultimately culminating in a punishment that was both psychological and lethal. Nero, her own son, became both the instrument and beneficiary of her downfall. Initially under her guidance, he grew increasingly independent and resentful of her influence. Agrippina's power, which had once been a source of security, became a liability. Historical accounts suggest that Nero, advised by courtiers, plotted to remove his mother, culminating in her assassination in 59 CE. Her death was the final act, but the suffering that preceded it, manipulation, betrayal, isolation, and the constant threat of violence, exemplifies the Roman strategy of punishment worse. The gradual dismantling of autonomy, the erosion of influence, and the strategic manipulation of relationships and perception before the act of killing. Parallel to Agrippina's trials, Theodora of Byzantium navigated the hazards of power in a different context. Rising from humble origins in the early 6th century CE, she became empress alongside her husband, Justinian I. Unlike Agrippina, Theodora was never physically executed, yet her life was marked by constant political and social threats that could have easily destroyed her. The Byzantine court, rife with intrigue and male-dominated authority, subjected Theodora to relentless scrutiny and opposition, demonstrating that punishment worse than death could take the form of psychological stress, social ostracism, and political isolation. Theodora's influence was extraordinary. She shaped imperial policies, intervened in governance, and protected vulnerable populations, particularly women. Yet each act of authority carried risk. Male courtiers and rivals sought to undermine her legitimacy through rumors, moral condemnation, and attempts to manipulate public perception. These strategies served as indirect punishment, systematically challenging her credibility and threatening the stability of her position. The psychological burden of navigating court politics, while maintaining her policies and influence, exemplifies a form of suffering as profound as physical punishment, prolonged and constant rather than immediate. Arsinoe IV, younger sister of Cleopatra V, represents another tragic figure whose punishment was both prolonged and psychologically tormenting. Unlike her sister, she never ruled Egypt directly, but became a pawn in the deadly games of dynastic power. During Cleopatra's reign and subsequent conflicts with Rome, Arsinoe was exiled to the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, a sanctuary that paradoxically functioned as both protection and imprisonment. She remained alive, yet completely powerless, knowing that her fate rested entirely in the hands of Roman authorities. This prolonged captivity, deprivation of autonomy, forced isolation, and exposure to constant threat, demonstrates the subtle cruelty of punishment worse than death living under a perpetual shadow of fear and uncertainty. Arsinoe's final demise came when Mark Antony ordered her execution in 41 BCE, after years of exile. Her life was ended not in battle but through calculated political decision-making. The combination of extended confinement, psychological torment, and eventual death illustrates how the Roman Empire's strategies targeted both body and mind. Punishment was designed to extend suffering over time, highlighting the extraordinary vulnerabilities of queens caught in the intersection of dynastic rivalry and imperial ambition. Through the stories of Boudica, Cleopatra, Zenobia, Agrippina, Theodora, and Arsinoe, a clear pattern emerges: female power in the ancient world was simultaneously respected, feared, and systematically constrained. Punishments were rarely straightforward, they were multi-dimensional, encompassing public humiliation, psychological manipulation, loss of family and lineage, social degradation and strategic subjugation. Rome, Byzantium, and other empires understood that killing a queen outright could be less effective than destroying her influence, reputation, and legacy first. The lives of these women also illustrate the extraordinary resilience required to navigate such perilous circumstances. Boudica led armies despite humiliation. Cleopatra negotiated with the most powerful men of Rome. Zenobia maintained dignity even in public chains. Agrippina maneuvered through court intrigue until her final moments. Theodora reshaped policy under constant threat. Arsinoe endured years of captivity before her execution. Their stories show that survival was not only physical but psychological, demanding intelligence, strategy, and courage against seemingly insurmountable forces. Ultimately, the punishment of queens worse than death served multiple purposes. It eliminated threats, reinforced social and political hierarchies, and sent powerful warnings to others. Public displays, exile, forced subjugation, manipulation of family, and psychological torment were tools carefully employed to control women, whose authority challenged male-dominated structures. The suffering was prolonged, the consequences multifaceted, and the impact enduring, extending beyond the individual to shape dynasties, empires, and historical narratives. By studying these stories, we gain insight into the calculated cruelty of imperial power, and the extraordinary fortitude of the women who resisted it. Their lives reveal the human cost of ambition, the vulnerabilities of female authority, and the enduring legacy of courage in the face of systemic oppression. The ultimate lesson is clear: surviving Rome's wrath, or that of any empire, was not merely about avoiding death, it was about enduring humiliation, protecting dignity, and asserting agency under circumstances designed to strip it away. These tales of queens punished worse than death remain as relevant today, as they were thousands of years ago, reminding us that the struggle for power, respect, and autonomy often comes with costs that are both visible and invisible, immediate and prolonged. The resilience of these women, their intelligence, and their ability to navigate the machinery of empires serve as enduring symbols of strength in the face of calculated cruelty. As we reach the culmination of these extraordinary stories, one thing becomes painfully clear for queens in the ancient world. Power was inseparable from danger. Each victory, each display of intelligence, each moment of agency carried with it the looming threat of punishment, often more sophisticated, calculated, and prolonged than death itself. The fates of Boudica, Cleopatra, Zenobia, Agrippina, and Arsinoe collectively illuminate a historical pattern. Empires understood that female authority could be neutralized most effectively not by execution alone, but through layered strategies that dismantled power, reputation, and identity over time. Consider the varied forms of suffering these queens endured. Boudica faced public humiliation and the annihilation of her people. Cleopatra endured political manipulation and the systematic undermining of her authority. Zenobia was paraded in chains, her sovereignty reduced to a spectacle. Agrippina navigated betrayal and eventual assassination. Theodora contended with relentless scrutiny and social ostracism. Arsinoe endured years of confinement before execution. In every instance, punishment was not a single act but a process, a carefully constructed assault on autonomy, dignity, family and legacy. The psychological dimension of this punishment cannot be overstated. Being alive under conditions designed to strip identity, control, and social standing inflicted a type of suffering more insidious than death. These women were forced to live with the consequences of defiance daily. Witnessing the destruction of their influence, observing the manipulation or subjugation of loved ones, and enduring constant threats to their safety and legacy. Survival in such circumstances required extraordinary resilience, strategic thinking, and mental fortitude. The gendered aspect of these punishments is equally striking. Male rulers often faced direct threats: battlefield defeat, assassination, or political exile. Queens, however, were subjected to a combination of humiliation, psychological torment, and symbolic subjugation. Parades of captives in chains, exiles to temples or distant lands, and public displays of family vulnerability were tactics explicitly designed to neutralize women without immediate execution. By eroding authority, reputation, and personal agency, empires ensured that queens were rendered powerless, while maximizing the ability of their defeat, as a warning to others. Family and lineage were weaponized as tools of punishment. Daughters, sons, siblings, and spouses became collateral damage in the strategic dismantling of a queen's power. Boudica's daughters were publicly humiliated. Cleopatra's children were made pawns of Roman politics. Arsinoe's confinement removed her from any familial influence. This manipulation of kinship reinforced suffering, demonstrating that punishment worse than death extended beyond the individual to destabilize entire dynasties. Beyond personal suffering, the impact of these punishments on society and history was profound. The public humiliation of queens sent clear messages to populations and potential challengers: resistance was futile, and defiance invited comprehensive destruction. Rome, Byzantium, and other empires leveraged these spectacles to consolidate control, manipulate perception, and codify gendered hierarchies, making the consequences of ambition highly visible. Through these acts, the punishment served dual purposes. It eliminated threats and reinforced imperial authority, leaving a lasting impression on contemporary and historical consciousness alike. Yet, despite the extreme cruelty, these queens displayed remarkable courage and resilience. Boudica led her people against overwhelming odds. Cleopatra used diplomacy, strategy, and ultimately, her own death to assert control over her legacy. Zenobia maintained dignity even in public chains. Agrippina maneuvered through court intrigue with intelligence and precision. Theodora reshaped Byzantine governance under immense pressure. Arsinoe endured years of captivity with fortitude. Their stories remind us that survival under calculated cruelty required not only physical endurance, but extraordinary mental and emotional resilience. The enduring lesson is that punishment worse than death often sought to destroy what made queens powerful in the first place: their autonomy, influence, reputation, and agency. Empires understood that eliminating authority and legacy could be more devastating than killing the body. These women's lives demonstrate the extraordinary stakes of female leadership in patriarchal societies, and highlight the cunning and fortitude necessary to navigate such perilous terrains. By examining these stories together, we see a broader historical pattern. The mechanisms of control employed by empires against queens were sophisticated, multi-layered, and often psychological: public displays, exile, captivity, manipulation of family, and systematic humiliation worked in tandem to neutralize authority, while making the consequences of defiance unmistakable. Survival in such contexts required a combination of intelligence, courage, and strategic acumen, qualities that allowed these women to resist, endure, and sometimes reclaim dignity even under the harshest conditions. Ultimately, the tales of Bodhi, Cleopatra, Zenobia, Agrippina, Theodora, and Arsinoe illuminate a timeless truth: power, especially for women in history, came with extraordinary risks. Punishment worse than death, prolonged suffering, psychological torment, public humiliation, and the stripping of agency, was a tool wielded to maintain control and enforce hierarchies. Yet these queens' resilience and strategic brilliance ensured that, despite suffering, their legacies endured. Their courage resonates across centuries, inspiring generations to recognize that true strength is not only in power held, but in dignity preserved, influence exerted, and agency maintained in the face of overwhelming adversity. History has often celebrated conquerors and emperors, yet the stories of these queens offer a different lens, one that reveals the price of ambition, the nature of cruelty, and the extraordinary capacity for endurance. They remind us that surviving systemic oppression and navigating relentless threats is a form of heroism in its own right. While empires sought to erase their authority, the legacies of these women endure, preserved in history, literature, and the collective memory of resilience against calculated cruelty. In the end, the ultimate lesson is clear: punishment worse than death is not measured solely by the act of killing, but by the deliberate dismantling of identity, power, and legacy. The lives of these queens show that surviving such punishment requires intelligence, courage, patience, and the unwavering will to maintain dignity under impossible circumstances. Their stories are both cautionary and inspiring, revealing the brutal realities of power and the extraordinary fortitude of those who dared claim it. As we close this exploration, remember: these queens were more than victims of empires, they were architects of their own resistance, masters of strategy, and symbols of courage. Their lives challenge us to understand the true cost of power, the nature of calculated cruelty, and the indomitable strength required to endure punishment worse than death itself. History may have sought to diminish their authority, but their legacies endure, echoing across time as testament to resilience, intelligence, and the unyielding pursuit of dignity in the face of overwhelming oppression.